Hi guys, and on today's Wisdom Wednesday, I'm going to talk about maxing out your VO2 max. If you are an athlete who relies on conditioning for their sport, whether you're an endurance runner, a mixed martial artist, a boxer, this presentation is going to be for you. VO2 max is the maximum amount of oxygen that can be utilized per kilo of body weight. Essentially, it's the body's ability to transport oxygen and use it. Oxygen is a sustainable fuel source for providing our muscles with energy. So the higher our VO2 max is, the higher a sustainable pace we can set and create, and the harder we can make our opponents work in order to keep up with us. And in today's video, I'm going to discuss methods of which you can improve your VO2 max, how you can make the most out of the conditioning you already have, and what training methods you might be missing or neglecting, which are going to lead to the greatest performance improvements in your conditioning. So what are the determinants of aerobic performance? What underpins our ability to complete work at a high but sustainable pace? Firstly, VO2 max, but it's not the holy grail that everyone thinks it is. The way I would describe VO2 max is it's like you're in line to get into a club, but it doesn't guarantee you're going to get past the bouncer. So it differentiates between non-elite and elite levels, but it's not what differentiates the best from the very best, but we'll get into more of that later. Important other factors to consider are lactate threshold. So how high can you sustain your exercise intensity before you start exercising at an intensity that is not sustainable? And finally, movement economy. How efficient are you within your movement? This is a massive one. Typically, athletes at the highest level all have high VO2 maxes, but the ones winning the gold medals aren't necessarily the ones who have the highest VO2 max. And this is where efficiency comes in. Now, you might be thinking, if you're, for example, a boxer, that you might rely more on something like the anaerobic system. If you're still confused by this, check out a video that I've already done, which explains what this training might look like for you. Equally, even if you are a power athlete, the aerobic system is going to be what you need in order to recover from high intensity explosive efforts. So the methods we're going to discuss today, we're going to look at intensity versus volume. So how high versus how much or how long. We're also going to look at the importance of strength training. If you're looking at this as a runner, be sure to check out my video that I've covered on strength training and running. We're going to look at plyometrics, so jumping and landing, and we're going to look at higher intensity interval training. Although popularized by Joe Wicks, we're going to explain what it really is and where people are missing a trick with it. So another thing that's synonymous with VO2 max is something that's called maximal aerobic speed. This is the minimum speed you can run at whilst using the maximum amount of oxygen that your body is capable of using. What you can see here from the research pictures that I've screenshotted is that the higher your maximal aerobic speed, the quicker the distance you can travel whilst using the highest amount of oxygen, and this is differentiated or does show a differentiation between the level you ultimately reach in team sports. So for example, we've got athletes who are covering 4.5 meters, 8 meters per second playing in the Norwegian national team, yet those who can only hit 4.3 meters per second are playing 3rd to 5th division. You might be thinking now, how can I calculate my maximal aerobic speed to see where I'm at in comparison to these athletes? Couple of simple methods I like. The first one is simply a 5-minute time trial. If you're an endurance athlete and you're used to pacing, then this could be an appropriate method for you. If you're a field sport athlete, then simply 2 cones, 25 meters apart, and cover as much distance as you can in 5 minutes. Again, going to be slightly limited by your change of direction ability, but still pretty useful test. And finally, very simple, find yourself an athletics track, complete a mile as quickly as you can. Once you've completed that a given distance, you're then going to divide that by the time it took you in seconds. So for example, if I completed a mile in 6 minutes, that's 360 seconds divided by 1600 meters. That will give me my meters per second, or my maximal aerobic speed. You can then use this figure, so let's say my maximal aerobic speed is 5 meters per second, to determine the intensity of training that you can then train at. But I will get onto specific methods in a few slides time. So what are the limiting factors of our VO2 max? Again, we said that VO2 max is the maximum amount of oxygen that the body can utilize per kilo of body weight. And there's 3 factors that underpin it. In our conditioning, we need to know which factor we're trying to address and why we're addressing it in order to get the most from our conditioning training. If there's one bugbear I have, it's people blindly applying training to themselves or their athletes, but not really specifically knowing what they're trying to address. So the first factor that limits VO2 max is oxygen delivery. This is the ability of the heart to pump blood out to the working muscles. I like to describe this as the motorway, if you will. The second factor that can limit our VO2 max is our body's ability to actually uptake this oxygen. And the final factor we're looking at is how much blood is that heart pumping out. So our conditioning training can address a combination of these 3 factors depending on what we're actually doing. So how do we target these limitations in our VO2 max or our aerobic system? The first type of training we could look at is training that targets the larger structures of the heart. This training is going to take longer to induce because we're looking at larger structures. And the analogy I use with the motorway is if you imagine you're trying to get to a destination and it's far away, i.e. pumping blood from the heart to the muscles. You need, for example, a motorway to get you on the right track, to get you most of the way. But then, so this is your delivery system. But you also need small little slip roads in order to be able to get to your destination. This is your uptake or your utilization system. So 3 minutes on, 2 minutes off at about 90% of your VO2 max is going to improve the ability of the heart to pump more blood to the working muscles. And oxygen uptake or oxygen utilization, we can look at something called sprint interval training. Now, because this improves the body's ability to uptake oxygen and it's effectively dealing with those little slip roads or the smaller blood vessels, you can induce changes in these pretty quickly. If you look at any of Alan Ruddock's sprint interval training research, then you can induce changes at this level in as few as 7 sessions. So that could literally be 4 sessions this week, 3 seconds the next week. But when you're doing these 30-second all-out intervals, they have to be as fast as you possibly can go. It's no use just jogging 30 seconds at a bit of a hard pace. You should be on the floor crippled with the intensity that these intervals are at. And finally, maximal cardiac output. Any type of training that forces the heart to beat as hard as it can is going to improve the amount of blood that the heart can pump out. Now, VO2 max, I mentioned earlier that this is not the holy grail. It differentiates lower level athletes to higher ones, but it doesn't differentiate the best from the very best. And if we're looking at endurance sports specifically, typically it's not the athlete with the highest VO2 max that wins, but the one who can sustain a higher percentage of an already high VO2 max. So again, it's not so much what is your maximum, it is what percentage of a higher VO2 max can you sustain. And interestingly, in research I was reading in my for my dissertation in boxing, found that typically boxers, yes, they'll have moments where they're above their maximum sustainable speed, but then also they'll have moments where they're recovering in between punches. But typically boxers are trying to sustain a pace of about 77% of their VO2. So when we look at improving VO2 max for field sport athletes, methods that I quite like are taken from Dan Baker's research and Gregory DuPont, about 170 grids. So you find out what your maximal aerobic speed is. So for ease of maths, let's say that's 5 meters per second. So for 30 seconds, you are going to cover 150 meters. So that's 5 meters per second over 30 seconds. So you cover 150 meters on a long rectangle. And then on a smaller side of a rectangle, so a football pitch, something like that, you're going to cover 70% of that pace. So you do 5 meters per second times by 0.7, so that's 3.5 meters per second. So over 3.5 meters per second, that's, let's do the maths, 70. So it's 150 meters in 30 seconds one way, and then only 105 meters in 30 seconds another way. The Eurofit method, typically done at 110% of maximal aerobic speed. So if your aerobic speed is for ease of maths, let's say 5 meters per second again, then for 15 seconds, you're going to cover a speed that is 110% of your VO2 max. So 5.5 meters per second for 15 seconds, and then the 15 seconds complete rest at the other side before you come back. And finally, Martin Boucher's literature on small-sided games. Now, depending on how many people you have in the team, how big the pitch is, you can be looking at addressing the physiological qualities of conditioning for your sport whilst also developing the technical qualities. This is also quite good if you're looking to differentiate between athletes who, for example, have high levels of conditioning but perhaps execute poor decisions under fatigue, or you might have athletes who are technically brilliant but also need to develop their conditioning. So depending on what type of athlete you have, might depend whether you do small-sided games and then some technical work, or you might even do conditioning work, then go into small-sided games and see how that conditioning affects it, or you might just do small-sided games and tick as many boxes as you can. It's been determined that performing a number of short intervals at over 100% maximum aerobic speed is a more effective method for developing aerobic power than long, slow distance runs. So if you're a boxer, take note of that, because you probably already have a high maximal aerobic speed. So as we said, high VO2 max is a prerequisite, but there are other factors that are important. We've got how efficient you are in your movement. For example, how efficient you are at running. How fast are you? Because if you're fast and you've got an ability to produce a lot of lactate, but you've also got a well-developed aerobic system, you've also got the ability to buffer this lactate or use it as a fuel source. Equally, how well can you sustain a percentage of an already high VO2 max? Even if you look at elite distance runners, there's still an element of fast twitch in them. You look at someone like Mo Farah, who can clock a sub 60 second 400 meter at the end of a grueling 5 or 10k. They've still got speed in their legs to burn. Interestingly, looking at boxing, this is a prime example of why having a impressive aerobic system is important. If we take the boxer number 2 and their critical speed, which is the maximum speed they can sustain aerobically, and boxer 1, if the fight takes place at the orange line, boxer 2 is in their cruise control. They're coming down to meet the demands of the fight. Boxer 1 is coming up. Now that means that they are using a non-sustainable pace. They're going to produce lactate, and if they've not got an ability to use this as a fuel source, this is going to limit their force production. So if the bout takes place where the orange line is, boxer 1 outside of their comfort zone, producing more metabolic waste products, and this is going to interfere with their ability to produce fast and powerful punches and affect his ability to perform at that intensity. Boxer 2 cruising, absolutely laughing. So how do you improve lactate threshold? Your ability to be at a certain intensity but not produce lactate, or your ability to use lactate as a fuel source. Gregory DuPont's research has looked at high intensity interval training, again looking at training intensity that is at or above 100% maximal aerobic speed. The work periods have to be slightly longer than the rest periods, and this is what's going to look to improve your lactate threshold. Recently, it's also been reported that high intensity interval training, so 6 to 12 minutes, 6 to 12 minutes of work, where you're at 100% VO2 max for 2 minutes and you're having a 1 minute rest period in between this. So movement economy. So this is how much oxygen does it cost you to run at a particular speed. If the oxygen cost is lower at a given speed, it's going to be easier for you to sustain that. And in fact, in elite distance runners, this is the one that appears to be the real kicker. When Kipchoge completed his sub 2 hour marathon event, there's been a lot of controversy about it. Listen to Ross Tucker's Science for Sport podcast if you want to know more. But basically, what they did in the design of the shoe was improve his movement economy. Arguably, they didn't change any of his physiological systems, but that shows you just how important being efficient at your sport is. There's a strong correlation between running economy and 10k time with runners with a similar VO2 max. So improving how efficient you are at running, either through being taught how to do it technically well, plyometrics, being strong relative to your own body weight, that are factors that help your efficiency of running. So we can enhance tendon stiffness, so the ability of your ankle to act like a spring through plyometric training, so jumping and landing. By optimizing body fat, sounds obvious, but if you're 10 kilos overweight, that's 10 kilos of mass more that you've got to shift. And in elite distance runners, yes, there is a genetic element to this in terms of anatomy, but finally, the things that are in our control is how strong we are relative to body weight, how springy we are, and how technically efficient we are. This is a nice schematic of strategies to improve running economy. So making sure that we've got muscles that are firing at the correct muscle lengths. Check out my video on loaded mobility if you're interested in that. Optimizing nutrition outside the scope of this video. Getting strong relative to your own body weight in squatting, hip hinging, and lunging patterns, especially if we're a runner. Training altitude, or again, in manipulating our environment. Now let's look at intensity compared to volume. So it's been determined that performing a number of short intervals at or above 100% maximal aerobic speed is more effective for building aerobic power than our long, slow distance runs. So we know that time at this intensity is crucial. So it's important for us to find out what this intensity is for us specifically, rather than following sessions blindly off the internet. Time limit an athlete can spend at MAS, or a high percentage of MAS, is often the determining factor. The longer the distance, the more successful a performer tends to be at holding a given percentage of their VO2 max. And finally, something to look at is the 80-20 rule that seems to pop up in endurance training a lot. This suggests that a lot of their training is sub-maximal, typically about 80%, with 20% high intensity. Now, the exactness of these figures I wouldn't worry about. The fact is, whether you're an endurance athlete, a boxer, whatever, you're going to need elements of both high intensity, so supra-maximal, above your maximal aerobic speed or VO2 max, and some sub-maximal stuff as well. Finally, especially if you're a boxer, consider junk mileage. What are you trying to get out of your sessions? If you're doing long, slow distance runs, telling me you're improving the maximum pace you can sustain in the ring, I'm probably going to raise an eyebrow and question you. So again, other factors relating endurance performance. If we are strong and we are powerful and we have springy ankles, then our movement cost of running is going to be much lower. If we are efficient, have good control over our body, and are strong relative to body weight, it's going to be easier to move our frame around the track, down the road. You get the idea. So there's still going to be an element of strength training and power training, even for an endurance athlete. And finally, if you can increase the speed at which you can run whilst using sustainable resources such as oxygen rather than non-sustainable energy resources, this is only going to improve your endurance performance. Here's an example training program for a field sport athlete, and the 2 minutes on, 1 minute off that you see on Thursday, that's basically done at around 80% of your VO2 max. Just a nice little way to bump up the aerobic system without being too stressful. And you can see that I've gradually increased the intensity. The strength work, again, I'd be looking at stuff like back squats, split squats, and deadlift variations within the 3 to 5 rep range to keep you nice and fresh. And the intensity gradually rises from the 2 minutes on, 1 minute off at 80% VO2 max, to eventually using 100% maximum aerobic speed, to finally using 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off at 110% VO2 max. So in summary, to improve your VO2 max, lift heavy. So by getting stronger, we're increasing the speed at which the fast twitch fibers can fire. We are increasing rate of force development, so how quickly you can produce force. And we're also improving running economy, because being stronger relative to our own body weight is going to make it less fatiguing to move our body weight down the track. By running fast, i.e. sprinting, we're going to improve our body's ability to deal with lactate. So by using sprints of 20 to 30 second efforts and then having 3 to 5 minutes recovery, we're getting used to ramping the system up and then letting our body recover. And finally, by incorporating plyometric exercises, so hopping, bounding, skipping, jumping, This is going to improve our ankle's ability to spring off the surface when we run and give us free energy, rather than being like a sponge every time our foot hits the floor and taking forever and a day to get back off it. If you're interested in strength training for running specifically, check out my video I've got on that. And if you have any questions for me, feel free to get in touch via your preferred channel. Hope you've enjoyed this week's Wisdom Wednesday.